But Mark, let's head back to the United States and the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs, on Global Affairs. Sorry.
Yes, September 12th, I was able to cover this virtually and took some original photos and notes. Trade War 2.0, question mark. The 2024 election and the global economy was the program, a couple of speakers and a moderator. There wasn't as much mention of the election and the two major presidential candidates as the billing of this indicated, but there was some general connections made. Quickly, this is Karl Friedhoff. He's the Marshall Bouton Fellow for Asia Studies. He was the moderator. One of the two speakers, Heidi Crebo-Rediker. She is Council on Foreign Relations as well as Trilateral Commission, a senior fellow, in fact, in the Center for Geoeconomic Studies at the CFR. And she served in the Obama administration as the State Department's first chief economist. So she's pretty confident in her predictions, but as I will indicate, her accuracy is seriously up to question. There was one other speaker, Diane Swonk, a chief economist for KPMG US, which is a major consulting firm, 3 decades of experience in the field. She's an expert in labor markets and monetary policy, and she regularly briefs the Federal Reserve and its regional banks. She noted immigration reductions and imposing current and especially more tariffs are always going to be inflationary, she warned, breathlessly warning us. Even while charging import tariffs takes the U.S. on a dangerous path. And I'll be talking more about her views and rebutting her a little bit later here. Some of the key talking points, Mike. However, the current U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports that Trump enacted are still being applied by Biden, these presenters said, which is a bit of a surprise when you consider that Biden tore down a lot of Trump's border wall and didn't allow other parts of it to be erected. Moving on, the November elections are highly consequential regarding spending, tax policy, including tariffs, and whether immigration will be curbed a lot, like Trump would do, or not, like Harris would do. And the rolling over of certain Trump tax cuts into the next presidential term could boost the budget deficit. The claim in the debate with Harris was that Trump's tax cuts benefited only the wealthy. Anyway, regardless of which candidate is elected president, these think tank wonks were saying, supply chain diversification must be dealt with. The U.S. must reduce its foreign, especially Chinese dependency on sensitive things like semiconductor production. And partisan political infighting will put the U.S. credit at risk. But the Chicago Council, the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, despite their nonpartisan claims, are partisan in a different sense. And that's always worth mentioning, that these think tanks always say they're nonpartisan, but the real divide isn't Democrat-Republican. The real thing to look at is nationally oriented versus internationally oriented. In other words, your home country and sovereignty versus globalism. That's the real partisanship to look for. Therefore, these think tanks are highly partisan. Anyway, some more talking points, sticking to the key ones. Swonk mentioned that the U.S. must never and never, ever default on its debt. Hence the need to bolster the credit rating of the U.S., plus anti-corporate sentiment. And this is good news in a sense. Anti-corporate sentiment is at a record high in both parties, part of a larger trend of the distrust of institutions, which includes the news institutions. So that shows the unity of the people is growing across the so-called partisan divide, which is something the globalists don't really like to see, Mike. They don't like to see people on both sides of the so-called aisle beginning to find more common ground. And I saw this admission last week when I talked about Russell Mead addressing the American Enterprise Institute. Anyway, China's looking at smaller kit manufacturing hubs in Mexico to try and get around U.S. tariffs applied to imports directly from China. And this was talked about at some length. China would therefore put a hub or smaller factory in Mexico and manufacture certain things that would go across the Mexican border into the U.S. and presumably they would escape the tariffs that would normally be applied to Chinese goods coming directly from China. And Ms. Swonk went on to say that jobs for immigrants may displace U.S.-based jobs, but she claimed that hiring foreign-born workers in the U.S. would somehow spur more native-born U.S. people to apply for such jobs. And she mentioned that 25% of all U.S. construction workers are foreign-born. And U.S. tariffs on imports, these two think tankers said, will spark a massive trade war. They warned this over and over again and said they're super inflationary to sustain and increase U.S. tariffs. But I always note, and I'll talk a little bit more about this after a video that we're going to show, various domestic taxes could also be defined as tariffs on the domestic economy. And all taxes, one way or another, one degree or another, always end up in the final price tags. These people speak as if only tariffs will end up in the final price tags, but all taxes, all kinds of taxes, property taxes, inventory taxes, income taxes, one way or another, one degree or another, will end up making products and services cost more. This is part of the deception that these globalists always sow. Anyway, I was able to ask a question, Mike, virtually. Naturally, I couldn't be there to this event. And my question was the only one chosen from the field of online questions. And I asked this, and we'll look at the video that will accent this even more. I asked, are tariffs really so bad? Doesn't a degree of protection grow our industrial base and generate needed revenue to rebuild U.S. infrastructure and boost, for example, semiconductor production domestically? And if you're ready, we can show a video where the moderator asks my question, and then we hear this rather windy, circuitous answer from Ms. Swonk on this. So we can fire that up if you're ready.
Well, let's take a question from online. I think this is one that we've been talking a lot about, industrial policy, tariffs, and there's a question here that in general we've said that they're inflationary, that they could spark a trade war if they're done at high levels. This question from online: are tariffs really so bad? Doesn't a degree of protection grow our industrial base and generate needed revenue to rebuild U.S. infrastructure and boost semiconductor production domestically? Diane, how would you respond to this?
Tariffs are not the most efficient way to do that. I understand there's a gap between what's economically efficient and what is best in terms of optimal for security issues. That said, the way tariffs work is that we pay them. And, we know when we tariffed, was it washing machines? They went up in price, but so did dryers. And they weren't tariffed because they're sold together. And consumers paid all of that. Now, some of the more recent research shows that also producers paid a lot of it in the United States. But instead of expanding the economy, it's a tax. And, it's sort of, this idea that the other country pays for it is not the case. Now, it's a tax designed to change our behaviors so that we don't buy certain items. And so that is certainly important. That said, when you're talking about taxing like the 60% tariff, the kind of spread of items that it's going to cover is very detrimental to the United States, to the U.S. consumer, and to demand and to production in the United States. And so, you really can very rapidly go down a rabbit hole, especially of tit for tat trade wars, because people respond to these things, that gets you into a situation that is a smaller economy. And that's why I said it's actually stagflationary to both curb immigration, raise tariffs at the same time. And it's why many of the people who are assessing these things, and we've run our own simulations, when you look at the extremes of some of the policy proposals, you get not only a recession, but stagflation erupting, which is a very, very difficult situation. So, it's a very dangerous path to go down. We're already down it. There are reasons for it on a security basis, but we have to be very judicial.
And a brief rebuttal to this, Mike. The way tariffs actually work, the nation paying the tariff to enter things into our market, they pay money into the U.S. Treasury, which reduces U.S. deficit spending and therefore the debt. Her claim that only consumers will ultimately pay that tax is way off base. The manufacturers in the U.S., when they offshore manufacturing, one of the things they look at is if there's no tariffs, if there's no real premium to pay to come back into the US market, they'll offshore the manufacturing and have foreigners make goods and import them into the United States. But if you have a tariff there of a sufficient amount, it doesn't have to be punitive, then that manufacturer who's thinking about offshoring US manufacturing will think twice. He'll think, wait a minute, I'm going to have to pay a premium to sell the stuff back in the US. Maybe I'll keep the jobs here. And when that happens, that keeps the tax base in the US intact. The local property tax base to pay for schools, to pay for bridges, to pay for highways, to pay for police, you name it. And so whenever jobs are sent overseas, which is incentivized by low tariffs, that is a forfeiture of US wealth, a forfeiture of growing wealth. And this is these are the aspects of this, and I could go on, that are never discussed by these globalists. And again, the other point is they always act as if tariffs are unique in making things cost more, when all taxes will ultimately make things cost more, products and services. And it's just something where you never get the full story. And but it's very important to outline what these people are saying so you can rebut them and get the full story out there. But at least they allowed the question to be asked. So we could elaborate a little more on UK column today. So back to you, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Yeah, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that in extra.